Why are there children at my table? The question left Charles Whitmore's mouth before his brain could shape it into anything softer. He stood in the foyer, with one hand on the brass of the front door, the other still holding the envelope of funeral arrangements the house had drafted for him. White lilies, music, the program printed in Noah's neat, years-ago handwriting. For a man who had taught himself the economy of control, the sight inside the dining room was an affront, the way a sudden gust is an affront to a carefully folded map. 4 small heads turned as if a sound had reached them from another room. Light blue cotton lay across their torsos, shirts that, when they caught the afternoon sun through the tall sash windows, glowed the same pale reassurance as Noah's photograph in the hallway. Him at 18, a blue shirt untucked at the hem, a laugh caught midair. The children's faces were a range of shadows and clarity, one with Noah's chin, another with the same slope in the nose, a third with his mouth. They sat at the long oak table that had been a monument in the house for decades, their knees a tangle beneath it. A pot of oatmeal steamed in the center, a wooden spoon left a crescent in the bowl. Maya Thompson moved between them with the hush of someone who had always learned to hold more than one thing at once. Food, children, a packet of papers clutched so that the edges bent like a promise. Charles's first movement was reflexive, a twitch of territory. He stepped forward without thinking, and his heel caught the leg of the antique vase that sat on the table's leaf. It toppled in a slow betrayal, ceramic rotating, a thin white arc of glass, and smashed against the wood. A child jumped. Maya's hand snapped out before she could think, the exact motion of a parent who would rather bruise her own palm than let a child feel the jagged. The sound of the vase breaking had the absolute clarity of a struck bell. Glass bit. There was a wet, quick intake of breath. The nearest child, Zoe, started and slid, hitting her elbow against the table and scraping it. Blood freckled her sleeve. Maya caught the child and gasped once, sharp and animal. Charles, who had spent a life rehearsing composure for cameras and committees, felt the edge of his control crack as if someone had opened a window in a room that had been kept hermetically sealed. He had been rehearsing what grief looked like, the dignified ledger of loss he had been taught to carry. He had not rehearsed human bodies, 4 of them, small and claiming space where only silence had been expected. "Get up," he said, the words brittle as dry wood. He did not know whether he spoke to the children or to the room. Maya turned to him slowly. Her face was composed, not calm. There was always a difference, and she displayed the small act of courtesy that makes the poor familiar with the rich. "Mr. Whitmore, please. They have no place else this morning." "That is my house," he said.
"It is Noah's house," she replied. Her voice held the gentle steadiness of someone used to being underestimated. "He left something for you. He asked me to bring them here today." Noah's name narrowed the distance between them with a sharpness that Charles felt in his throat. He had spent a year sleeping with the memory of his son like a photograph under glass, carefully, reverently, but separate from business and touch. The boy, the photographs, the clean grimness of a funeral arranged by professionals. He had not allowed for a son who fathered, who hid, who chose the margins on purpose and then pressed those margins into the center of the house. Charles's hand trembled against the envelope in his other pocket, the one with the funeral plans, and he reached for the vase shards before he realized. A splinter of glass had nicked Maya's palm when she caught Zoe. Blood warmed her skin, but she held the child as if she were a thing of porcelain, but living, solid, demanding. For a heartbeat, Charles saw nothing but the economy of gestures, the way she bandaged the elbow with the cuff of a sweater, the way one child's thumb found Noah's photograph on the table, as if drawn by an invisible thread. He did what he had always done when decisions needed masking. He made an order. "Call for the house doctor," he said, voice flat. "Security, make sure no press cars have come down the lane." Olivia, who had guarded the Whitmore house for 7 years and moved through it like a shadow with shoes, materialized at the stairhead without flourish. She gave him a look without comment, 30 years in her face, and turned on her heel to do it. The household mechanics began to click into place around a sight none of them had anticipated. The children were quiet in the way that small people are when the adults around them have stopped speaking. A plate clinked as Malik spooned oatmeal, tentative, as if measuring the solidity of the world with each mouthful. Jaden, smallest and with a curious freckle at his temple, examined the carved edge of the table, as if cataloging the history of the wood. Ella watched Charles. Her eyes were large and unafraid in a way that made him feel naked. He swallowed something bitter. "Who brought them here?" he demanded. Maya straightened, veins like rails beneath her wrist. "Noah put everything in an envelope with instructions. A courier was to deliver it to me on the morning of his memorial. He asked I bring these children and the letter to you. For a man whose days were measured in numbers, stock returns, philanthropic endowments, properties, the idea of a courier operating outside his chain of command felt like a small mutiny." He stepped forward, toward the table, The light caught on the photograph of Noah and drew Charles's eye. In the frame, Noah's jaw was softened by a smile, his blue shirt catching light like a summer sky. Noah would not, you don't know him then, Maya said, and there was no malice in it.
Just a fact that landed like a stone. The envelope in Maya's hands was thick. It had the feel of someone who had packed a life into paper. Photos, a small clump of photocopies, a letter written in his hand. She placed it on the table like it was incense, as if what was inside might change the air. The courier, a young man with a neutral face, waited in the hall while Olivia checked his identification. He had done his part of whatever contract Noah had made. He departed when asked, the door settling with the same stubborn sigh as everything else in the house. Charles opened the envelope with fingers that did not belong to him any longer. The first page was a short note in Noah's handwriting, just 3 lines. He read them aloud, his voice low and at the edge of the room, as if not to disturb some fragile domestic miracle. Dad, if you are reading this, it means it is the morning of my memorial. There are things I could not bring myself to tell you while I was alive. Please, read everything. Please, decide what you will do next with care. There was an ache in Charles that was not only sorrow. It was the particular ache of surprise, of having loved someone as if from the lip of a photograph, and finding instead the mess and warmth and iterations of a life you'd never noticed. He had, for years, settled into the tidy certainty that a son had been an extension of the Whitmore line. For Noah to have stepped out of the line and fathered children who now sat in the dining room like an accusation, this rearranged the categories of his life. He should have closed the envelope then. He should have set the papers aside and carried on with the memorial. Instead, in the way sorrow makes one greedy for proof, he lifted the next sheet. There was a photocopy of a birth certificate, then of a school enrollment form with Noah's signature in the lower corner. There were snapshots, a toddler with Noah's laugh, a child asleep on a couch with Noah's book open on her chest, a photograph of a small hand curled around a skateboard. The house smelled suddenly of other people. Soap, different outside laundering, the faint tang of a cheaper detergent that Charles registered without naming. Noah kept them hidden, he said finally. The sentence was a bridge lowered across a chasm. He kept them safe, Maya answered. He asked me to look after them if something happened. He trusted me to bring them here when he felt time was right. I thought today would be that morning. The way she said that last sentence, present tense, almost like she could put the hinge back on a door, made something inside Charles snap. For a moment his father's voice rose in his memory, the old Whitmore imperative that family was also control. He lashed out at what he knew in that moment, not at what he had just learned. You put strangers in my house, he said, voice uneven. These are not strangers, Maya said. They are Noah's children.
Anger, when it arrives in a man weathered by power, does not always look like thunder. Often it is a small, sharp thing, a footfall louder than intended, a word dropped like a stone that skips along the water. Charles's hand found the back of a chair, and the polished surface offered no satisfaction. Instinct took him to spectacle, public outrage thinly dressed as righteous fury. He slammed the chair back instead, and the vase he had missed earlier gave, as if the room could not bear more sudden movements. The crash of china sufficed in itself for his temper. Zoe cried out. The sound was a small, clean thing that tethered him to immediate duty. He had not intended harm, he told himself. It had been reflex, a loss of decorum. But the sight of Zoe's scraped elbow, of Maya's palm bruised where a shard had nicked her, softened him in a way that surprised himself. He did not step forward to touch. Instead, he felt a wash of something like shame. He could see, in a disordered mirror of his own private grief, the ways his absence had made room for other lives to grow, quietly, without his blessing. Sit down, he muttered, which in his language was apology and command braided together. Maya sat. She seated the children by instinct, aligning bowls, rearranging chairs with a muscle memory of making unlikely spaces work. Charles took a chair at the end of the table opposite Noah's framed photograph and unfolded the letter he had not finished reading. He read the second page with a voice that trembled only subtly, as if it were business correspondence and he had to keep the cadence steady. Noah's handwriting sloped to the right. The sentences were spare, not for lack of emotion but for economy. Confession, some explanation, then an appeal. I couldn't tell you while I was alive, Charles read aloud, because I was afraid you wouldn't understand. I love them. I loved in a way that doesn't fit into the Whitmore ledger. They are my life in the way that matters every day. I am sorry for hiding. I am asking you, Dad, to do something for me when I can't ask anything for myself. See them, protect them, name them into whatever future we can build. If you can't, if you will not, then please honor me by finding someone who will. The words pried open something inside him. He had always needed to be useful. To be called upon gave him direction. But Noah's request was not a business problem. It was a moral adjacency he had no instruction for. He felt the room contract around the soft thump of the children's feet as they tucked into their oatmeal. Noah's voice, present in that room through ink and paper, was both a summons and an indictment. Charles let himself sink into the chair like an animal surrendering to a trap. The letter crumpled in his hands when he observed it too long. He had thought of reparations as a ledger, amounts, payments, foundations.
But here was a form of reparation not reducible to numbers, a demand to step into the small quotidian instruments of care, making breakfast, mending a scraped elbow, learning the names of children who had his son's laugh. He felt the old Whitmore defenses rise, the board, the press, the trustees who had already mapped out the public face of grief. If he acknowledged these children, he would open the house to the world. There would be pictures, testimonies, lawyers. Someone like Preston Bishop might scent weakness and circle. The thought of it made a coldness in his gut. But then the small hand of a child reached for Noah's photograph at the center of the table, fingers tracing the glass as if feeling for the person inside. The gesture opened him in a way no board meeting ever could. He had a memory then, unbidden and crystalline. Elena laughing in the chapel over a ridiculous hymn, Noah at her knee with oatmeal on his chin, a blue shirt draped over an arm. Elena, whose letters he had kept in a cedar box, who had believed without ceremony that family is formed of actions rather than pedigrees. He had not known then how easy it would be to let the house harden without those actions. Maya watched him. She did not plead. Her expression was not waiting for contrition. It held an information quietly offered. "He wanted you to have this," she said, nodding at the letter. "He thought you might listen." He considered the idea that his son, in the act of leaving, had attempted to connect him to the inconvenient fact of his life. Noah had placed himself between them and made the choice he had always withheld while alive, to ask for something from the man at the head of the family. It was the most intimate act someone had asked of him since his wife's letters had stopped coming. "I didn't know," he said. He heard his voice and felt its disbelief. "I didn't know." "No." Maya's reply was soft as linen. "You didn't." The word was a map of everything that had come before. The Whitmore formality that had kept a son at arm's length, the house of ordered rooms, the rituals of place without presence. He opened his mouth to make the shape of apology and halted when the simplest thing presented itself. He could not restore the time he had missed, but he could alter tomorrow. "Stay for the memorial," he said at last, and he surprised himself that his voice did not betray more calculation than regret. "Sit in the front. Walk down with me." The offer startled the children into a new kind of stillness. No one applauded it. There was no audience. It was a small ordinance that required only that he keep his word. The household moved as if the offer were a signal. Olivia fetched a first aid kit and sat at the kitchen island with a practical face. Dr. Penrose, an attending doctor who had been steady at the Whitmore family's bedside for years, came within the hour, having been summoned by protocol and Olivia's quiet insistence.
He cleaned the cuts, Zoe's elbow, the small nick on Maya's palm where she had caught the vase. His hands were efficient and kind, an embodiment of the small mercies the house now needed. Charles watched the doctor stitch Maya's palm, the needle drawing a thin line of thread like a seam stitching a rent. It was a quiet technical competence, and yet there was, in the motion, an image that lodged itself in him. Small hands mended. He had mended other things by signing checks or endowing rooms with names, but never had he sat and watched the literal work of repair so close, so slow. The stitches pulled tight. A small knot of cotton sat like a promise on the skin. Maya flinched once, and then steadied herself in a way that was private. "You should let me pay for this," Charles said. Not as a generous offer, but as an attempted repair of social distance. Maya looked at him for a long, simple second. "There will be time for payments and trustees," she said. "Right now, these children need breakfast, and if they are to sit through a memorial, we need them to be safe." He nodded because the alternative would be to make an argument he had no right to make. The children crowded close to him after the doctor left, their small bodies acting as a weather of warmth. Malik told a story about a broken bicycle that made Jaden howl.
The laugh was a shock of color against the dull grief he had been rehearsing. Noah's handwriting sat on the table between them like a hinge. When they finished eating, Maya folded the envelope with a care that suggested this was more than paper. She handed him one small item, a photocopy of a letter Noah had kept to himself, the last page of which read, "If you can't do this for me, then at least do not make them invisible. Name them. Let them have a place. It will mean more than anything else." Noah's words were not a demand for money or position. They were a request to be given the dignity of name and place. Charles folded his hands around that paper and felt the weight of the house press against him. He could imagine, with desperate clarity, the board convening, statements issued, press releases drafted, an onslaught of questions about lineage and legitimacy. He could imagine the way Preston Bishop would smile in public, a predator in bespoke suits. But the child's thumb still rested on the photograph of Noah, and that small continuity was more precise than any boardroom measurement. "Come with me," he found himself saying, and the sound of his own voice registering as something other than a decree made it both softer and more dangerous. He stood and, for the first time in months, moved through the house with people following. The framed photos in the hallway lined up like small witnesses. Elena with a book on her knee, Noah at graduation, a span of light like a promise. They reached the small morning room beyond the hall where the family had always stacked policy and memory.
Sun poured through the tall windows and set the dust motes to slow motion. Charles took a breath as if preparing to step into a public place where his personal choice would be visible to others. He felt, in that small corridor where doorways created thresholds, as if he carried a weight that could be measured not in money, but in consequence. There would be consequences. He did not delude himself. Yet, as the children shuffled closer and Noah's letter rested in his palm, the ledger in his head shifted from columns of totals to a list of names: Malik, Zoe, Ella, Jaden. The names tasted peculiar in his mouth, like a foreign coin suddenly recognized. He looked at Maya, not as an employee now, not only as a caretaker, but as someone who had sheltered his son and their children with a quiet courage he had never purchased, and he understood, with a clarity that hurt, the smallness of the life he had been leading. From today, he wanted to say something grand, a pronouncement that would simplify the mess, but the house had never been a place for grand pronouncements. It was a place of acts. He pushed open the door that led to the chapel, the wood sighing against the threshold. The lilies that had been arranged for the memorial leaned toward each other like a small congregation. The room smelled of wax and memory. The hymnals sat in the pews like promises waiting to be kept. He led them to the front row, and for a moment felt the gaze of empty space, as if the house itself were watching. There would be many eyes later, the boards, the presses, Preston Bishops. He could not foresee the legal arguments or the slanted articles that would find purchase in the tabloids. But he could decide what to do right here, with his body and his voice, in the house where Noah had been raised, and where children now sat with oatmeal warming their chins. He did not yet make a public pronouncement before the assembled congregation. That act would demand the courage of a man who could grab a spotlight and not flinch. Instead, he took the children's small hands when they offered them, and felt the texture of living flesh, warm, calloused, real. He did not promise them the world. He promised something perhaps harder for a man of his means: presence. A single small thing happened then that was both private and public. Zoe, as if compelled by habit, picked up a blue ribbon from the locket tray and tied it into her hair. The ribbon matched the shirts. It was an insignificant act, but it drew something in Charles like a thread. He realized the blue, the shirts, the ribbon, Noah's photograph, had been a language between them all, a color that had taught him more than any of his trustees had about belonging. He folded the letter again and tucked it into his breast pocket, as if to carry the command close to his heart.
He had done many things in his life, built companies, endowed rooms, purchased influence, but he had never before let a letter, left by a son he barely understood, dictate the first move of a new chapter. At the threshold of the chapel, with the echoes of footsteps in the hallway and the lilies like small halos, he turned to Maya and the children and said simply, "Stay. Be here. We will start with that." Outside, the lane hummed with the city indifferent to the tremors inside. Inside, the house waited like an animal holding its breath. The decision had been made, tender and precarious. It was not a resolution. It was a choice that would require him to do the work of making family, publicly and privately, in ways he had not known how to do before. If this scene moves you, pause for a moment to like or share. There are stories that need to be seen. They filed into the small chapel together in the thin light. Noah's photograph occupied the central place on the dais, as if he were present by other means. Charles felt the heavy hush of morning, tempered by the new, quieter sound of children exchanging secrets under their breath. He sat with them like a man learning to be less alone. The letter in his pocket warmed against his breast like a small ember. He smoothed his hand across it as if he could steady what he could not yet name. He had not yet spoken before the assembled friends and mourners. He had not, in the parlance of his world, made a statement. But the active motion of taking 4 small hands and drawing them into the rhythm of the Whitmore house was a first sentence spoken aloud. Whether it would be read as generosity, concession, or something thinner like reputation management would unfold in the hours and days to come. For this morning, it was enough that they were not invisible. When the service concluded and people drifted toward the reception rooms in the pattern of a life that knew how to perform sympathy, a familiar face approached, the old family doctor who had stitched Maya's palm, his movements a punctuation of practicality. "You did the right thing," Dr. Penrose said quietly to Charles, not offering platitudes, but a kind of steady human appraisal. "Whatever else happens, they have a place now." Charles's reply was small. "They have Noah." The sentence nodded around both pride and loss. Maya gathered the children as if she were an axis around which they could orbit, and for a moment, the 3 of them, herself, the children, this man who had been more myth than father, stood at the edge of the room in a cluster of ordinary gestures, a hand on a back, a readjusted sleeve, a small yawn. There would be calls to make, opinions to weather, lawyers to consult. He had no illusions, yet there was an unfamiliar steadiness in him, like the feeling of a tightened stitch. As guests left and the chatter receded, Charles walked back through the hallway, where the framed photos watched like small juries.
Noah's image looked at him as it always had, open-mouthed, easy in a way Charles had not learned to allow himself. Charles paused before the frame and placed a hand over the glass, a private benediction that was also an acceptance. He felt the letter heavy in his pocket, a tangible record of a secret life that had, in the end, made a claim on him. He did not yet know how he would tell the board, how he would face Preston Bishop's smile, or what legal entanglements might grow like vines around the house. He did not know if the city would embrace them or tear them apart. But he knew the direction he would choose in the first light: to let the children be seen, to let them sit at his table, and to begin the hard work of naming them into the life of the house. He stood there a long time, feeling the weight of all the things he could no longer pretend to control. The oak tree outside, planted by his father decades before, threw a long shadow across the gravel. It had been a marker of lineage. Today, in that shadow, he felt only the stubborn reality of a living thing that held storms and seasons and still stood. Inside, someone hummed a tune without words, a small child's melody, and the sound threaded through the rooms. Charles folded his hands, and in a voice he reserved for the discreet and necessary, he said to no one in particular, "We will begin." The house answered by making the smallest, most human of noises, a kettle beginning to boil, a child's gentle laugh. It was the sound of life not yet repaired, but working its way back into shape. They woke the next morning to the kind of light that made the house look newly honest, sunlight pouring through the tall windows, laying itself along the stair rail and across the framed photographs, as if trying to smooth the past. Children's noise filled the rooms in ordinary ways, murmured bargaining over a second slice of toast, a hurried exchange about a lost toy, small rhythms that suggested life could accrete, stitch by stitch, if someone merely kept showing up. Charles moved through the house as he had the morning before, but now the movement was less a procession of control than an attempt to hold pace with things he had not previously accounted for: snacks to find, collars to straighten, the precise way a child liked their pajamas tucked. He watched Maya direct the kitchen like someone leading an orchestra composed of mismatched instruments, and felt with a fresh and unwelcome clarity how little he'd ever known the instruments. There was an ease to how she arranged the morning, bowl set in a practiced arc, a kettle eased to a simmer,
a stack of mismatched cups pressed into service that signaled competence and care rather than improvisation. They ate together around the oak table, but the feel had changed. The table no longer felt like a relic he had the right to guard.
It hummed in the new light, with a small debris of life, a smear of jam on its edge, a pencil left near a placemat, a napkin folded into a paper airplane. Malik traced a map into the wood with his finger, and Charles found himself listening to the map rather than reading it. When Malik told a story about a scraped knee at school, Charles listened the way one learns a language late in life, awkwardly, sometimes missing context, but intent. Word spread, as words do. Someone at the memorial reception took a photograph that night. No press gleam about it, merely a still captured on a guest's phone. Charles at the end of the table, 4 children at his side, Noah's photograph between them. In the morning, the image was everywhere. Someone had uploaded it to social media, and the photograph had the quick, contagious life of images meant to be seen. The comments began politely at first. Curiosity, condolence, a string of people who knew the family offering sympathy. But the tone changed as it traveled, the way water tastes different after it runs through a new pipe. By noon, the threads had found a feed that liked to harvest outrage for clicks, and the image was cropped and styled and given a headline that insisted on a scandal where there had been a family. Preston Bishop did not need a photograph to know where to place his stake. He moved with the precise, practiced subtlety of someone for whom contests were a game of small, publicized chips. A picture, to him, was not a human being, but leverage. He appeared on the periphery the following afternoon at the foundation office. No one invited him, yet he seemed to assume the right to be there, and his smile was the kind of oil that made people inside the house uneasy. A board member, natural in the appetite for headlines that flavored his sentences, called a meeting. Trustees gathered in a room with polished tables and an air that was half indignation and half calculation. The press montage that followed was a quick, efficient business. Clips of Charles walking through the hallways intercut with thin, bitter voiceovers that speculated about impropriety. Headlines that hinted with careful innuendo at paternity disputes. A piece that suggested the Whitmore Foundation might redirect funds in ways the public could find questionable. The house, which had long bent itself to the niceties of reputation, felt the old muscles tense reflexively around a nerve. Olivia increased patrols. Dr. Penrose, summoned more than once, advised on stress and sleep. Security vans took new positions at the lane. Maya felt it like a slow pressure against her skin. She had sheltered these children in ways that were physical and habitual. She had not anticipated how visibility would bleed the margins of their quiet into a public spectacle.
She tried to keep the children centered, knowing that a child's sense of safety required the smallest, most literal acts. A warm bath, a story read under the covers, a song hummed while tucking in the edges of a blanket. She kept them away from screens. That kind of rumor, she believed, could metastasize in a child's imagination into something monstrous. Devante arrived the week after the memorial and brought with him a weathered watch and a temper that eased like a tide. He had been Maya's brother since childhood. Their history was a landscape of overlapping duties and loyalties, not a tidy narrative. He had been absent at times, for reasons the family guarded with a kind of embarrassed silence. When he knocked at the back gate and Olivia let him through, it was with a hesitance a man shows when re-entering a house he once left with reasons he cannot fully explain. He was not a polished ally, but his presence mattered in the way of people who understood what it meant to stand in a doorframe between accusations. "You good?" Charles asked on the doorstep, a test and a truce in one sentence. Devante's eyes measured him for a quick second. He was broad in the shoulders, with a kind of muscle that had not been bought but earned. "I'm here for Maya and the kids," he said bluntly. "That's enough." He stayed. Where Maya moved like the conductor of small moments, Devante was the hand that kept the perimeter. He fixed a leaky drain in a utility room, patched a hole in a shed where a sleeping place for the older children might be. He argued, quietly and with a natural antagonism toward the Whitmore brand, about what the children should be allowed to do. Whether they should go to town for a haircut without the press, whether they should have playdates, whether they should keep their clothes worn to the edges of comfort or be dressed like hostages to propriety. The arguments were small and real. They did not make headlines, but they mattered at home. Preston, sensing his moment, escalated next through counsel. The board's letter demanded clarification. They wanted to see documentation. They wanted legal proof. They asked that DNA testing be conducted to confirm lineage if an inheritance or trusteeship was going to be affected.
The letter was precise, courteous in a way that suggested a blade. In the margins of the house, legal counsel warned Charles that failing to comply with the board's demands could result in injunctions, public lawsuits, drawn-out court fights made up of testimony and paperwork, and the kind of slow attrition that erodes public sympathy. Charles read the letter aloud in his study, the paper rustling with a crispness that made its demands feel immediate and ordinary. He heard Noah's voice in the corner of his mind. Name them. Let them have a place. The phrase had become less a plea and more a moral pressure.
The board's demands read like a route map back to a place where the Whitmore name would be uncontested, but it felt like a map that assumed the house would choose its old safety instead of the children. He made a decision then, not a dramatic theatrical move, but a procedural one that was nevertheless rooted in the same stubbornness that had built his fortunes. He called the board and scheduled a meeting, not to ask for permission, not to plead, to announce a course of action he was already committed to. The letter he produced before the board was the one Noah had left him, sealed again in a yellowed envelope, with the son's handwriting visible through the glass of the paperweight. He read excerpts without showmanship, select lines like a surgeon making a careful incision, and he answered the demands for DNA with a measured but unbending statement. The Whitmore Foundation would undergo a process to verify claims where necessary, but no child would be made secondarily vulnerable by whatever procedural steps the trustees desired. If the Foundation's existence depended on excluding Noah's children from its care, he would prefer there be no foundation. The room made a small, shocked noise, less of anger than of surprised calculation. Trustees shifted in their chairs. Preston's smile shortened to a thin line. There were threats of legal recourse. There were stern reminders that the Foundation's board had fiduciary responsibilities. Charles listened. He did not flaunt anger. He did not show the kind of anger that is spectacle. He showed instead a willingness to carry consequence. If our foundation cannot be trusted to provide sanctuary to those our son named, then perhaps it does not deserve to exist on the terms we have set, he said quietly. We can dissolve it. We can restructure. But I will not sign a paper that makes children invisible to save a reputation. The threat was an act of leverage, but it was also one of moral clarity. It placed the trustees in a position where their choices would be visible as either protective or self-preserving. Some left the room stunned. A few shifted their loyalties slowly enough that over weeks the Foundation's public face began to change. Statements were written more carefully, philanthropy rebranded with a new humility. Preston took it as a personal affront. He began to marshal legal advisors who specialized in contestations around estate law and trust statutes. He filed for limited discovery. He did not at first seek custody or guardianship of children. He aimed to force the Whitmore governing structures into a procedural corner. The house received anonymous calls. Voicemails left at odd times contained the hum of a man's breath, and the thudding suggestion of threats meant to be vague but heavy. Someone slashed the tires on a car in the lane one night, and the children slept uneasily in the small hours until Olivia came to sit with them.
She brought an extra blanket and a cup of something warm and sat in the doorway, with the practical solidarity of someone who had guarded people through worse. "We'll be all right," she told them, the way the elderly tell children a story, with conviction that is half for them and half for themselves. The children nodded, not because they believed every word, but because routines mattered. One more cup of warm drink, one more adult near the bed, and the world felt safer. Then the oak burned. It was not a roaring totality, something less cinematic than that. It was a deliberate, messy act that caught on a single root and climbed in greedy tongues. The tree's bark charred, its leaves blackened in a precise arc, as if someone had aimed a little rage at the place that held the family's name. Noah's smaller plaque at its base, simple brass, melted at the edge. Firefighters came, hoses unfurled like snakes, the smell of smoke lifting into the winter air. The children watched from the window with a silence beyond words. They had seen enough to know the sound of emergency, without understanding purpose. Maya put her arm around them and stood as if a human barrier. The investigation that followed was methodical. The police looked for accelerants, for patterns. They took statements and measured the angles of charred bark. Preston publicly condemned the act with a statement that was neat and perfunctory. Privately, someone connected to his network floated a rumor in a bar that the attack had nothing to do with him, and mouthed the phrase as if that were absolution. Devante kept a list of people he suspected, which he did not air in public, but shared with Olivia and Dr. Penrose in the quiet of the service kitchen. They worked in small teams, security footage combed,
license plates checked, neighbors interviewed. Nothing conclusive came of it in the first days. The arsonist had worn a hood, and the surveillance cameras had been damaged in a way that suggested knowledge of where cameras were and how to avoid them, knowledge that could point to an insider or someone who had studied the estate. For Maya, the oak's damage was an assault on the physical memory of Noah. She stood at the site with a hand on the charred trunk and felt a grief that was layered with fear. Her children wanted to touch the blackened bark, and she let them, explaining in the spare, practical language adults use to help children build meaning. Trees burn, sometimes, she said, but they can grow around the scar. They keep standing. The line itself was rehearsal for later. The house would keep standing if the people inside it decided to be the architects of repair. In the attic, someone found the nursery. It was Devante who forced the old lock on an upper door with a crowbar when a cleaning crew came to clear out decades of stored furniture. The attic had been an archive of the house's private life. Trunks with hotel labels, boxes of old clothes, a stack of Elena's hymnals.
Behind a false wall, in a space apparently meant for storage, but clearly repurposed years before, there were children's drawings pinned to the rafters and a small wooden box of toys. A mattress lay in the corner, a faded blanket folded over it. On a shelf, under a dust-dulled lamp, were several letters tied with a blue ribbon. Elena's handwriting, known to Charles as the hand that had once filled his life with light, was unmistakable in the slant and curl of the loops. The letters were not long confessions, but small, elliptical entries, a record of tenderness that revealed less scandal than intention. In one, there was a line that stopped Charles as if a hand had touched his sternum. If our son must choose the edges of life he finds comfortable, we must make the house a place that allows returning. Do not harden this place into a museum. In another, she wrote of Noah's laugh, of the way he had come home once carrying a small child's hat, his pockets full of rocks and excuses. The papers were not an answer to all the questions, but they were proof of an orientation, a woman who had believed in the longing as a practice, not bounded by pedigree. Finding them shifted something in the house. Elena's letters became a kind of moral compass in the weeks after, read aloud at small moments, quoted in private conversations, used by Charles when he needed to remind himself what the house could be beyond image. He kept them in his pocket sometimes, as if proximity might thicken his resolve. Renee arrived at the Whitmore gates almost a month after the memorial with an old photograph and a steady, uncomplicated manner. Her presence was a thread from something that had happened years before, a scarred hospital somewhere in Memphis and files that had been miscatalogued or misread. She was not a savior, but a witness. She had worked at the clinic where Noah's mother, Elena's friend, a woman unnamed in the archival files, had sought help years ago. Renee's voice had the dry cadence of someone who had watched too many things be made smaller than they were. "I don't know everything," she said plainly, "but I know what gets misplaced." She spoke of a tray with names written in a ledger, of a nurse who had been frightened, and a clerk who had left a drawer open. She had records, copy-paste that had been boxed and forgotten, and a birth log with handwriting that matched the entries on doctrine the city kept. The documents were not a simple solution. Chain of custody was frayed, and the paper trail had gaps. There were names that had been crossed out, a birth certificate with a clerical note that suggested a mix-up. Her testimony suggested the plausible existence of another boy, one written into the ledger one way, and then, through human error, entered into the system as someone else. The possibility of Isaiah, that name now moved in the circuits of the house with the same gentle inevitability as the other names, felt like a small private earthquake.
It reframed what the Whitmore lineage might mean and exposed a bureaucratic cruelty that had little to do with a single family and much to do with the institutions that render people invisible by not keeping careful enough track. Preston smelled opportunity. He filed a motion seeking investigatory access to records and suggested a public hearing might be necessary. His attorneys drafted language that cast the Whitmore Foundation as needing clarification over benefactors and beneficiaries. He cultivated the press, gave interviews filled with insinuations disguised as civility. But Charles, changed by the letter and what he had learned in the attic, moved differently now. He did not attack, he answered. He offered to open the Foundation's own records, to commission independent audits, to invite Renee as a consultant on the reorganization. When the board balked, uncertain, fearful, he made them choose, restructure the Foundation to be accountable or risk its dissolution. He made the threat without theatrics, not as a bluff, but as the calculation of a man who had little left to gamble with but his name. At the board meeting that followed, trustees argued in carefully barbed sentences. Fiduciary duty, they said, protecting assets, ensuring donors are secure. Preston paced through the meeting like a man who loved the smell of suit fabric in a room full of power, and he wove a narrative about stewardship and the need for proof. The room felt like winter. Charles watched their faces, the ways loyalty and self-preservation folded. He looked at Maya, at Devante, at Olivia, and at the children who had been led, in all of this, to a place where grown-ups bargained over their future. He was aware of his precariousness in a way that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with moral clarity. He could have ceded to the board's procedural demands and let attorneys parse the consequences in public while he retreated back to the safer measures of obituary writing and plaque-bind. He chose not to. He offered a compromise that was also a binding moral statement. He would consent, privately, to DNA testing to satisfy due diligence, so long as the tests were conducted with safeguards that protected the children's privacy and dignity. No public spectacle, tests administered by a third-party accredited lab, results transmitted first to counsel and then to a guardian ad litem if necessary, and with the binding promise that the process would not be used for public theatrics. If the Foundation insisted on weaponizing the process to exclude the children from Noah's legacy, he would resign and dissolve the board, removing the institution's resources rather than seeing them used to hide truth. Better to have no foundation than to have one that erases children for the sake of an image, he said quietly. The words settled like thrown stones into a still pond. Some members considered compliance. Others saw the wisdom in his stance.
Preston's face grew small and tight. His ambition had met a wall he had not anticipated. In the end, the board agreed to the privacy parameters and to review a restructured mission statement that would shift the Foundation toward child welfare and restorative initiatives in Noah's name. It was a pause, not a victory. Legal processes, both Preston's and others, would continue. They would be long and messy, and not always satisfying. But Charles had begun to change what the terms of the fight would be. The legal side moved slow. Labs scheduled dates. Counsel advised about chain of custody. Papers were notarized. There were nerves. The children fidgeted through the waiting rooms like small weather. Maya held their hands with a steadiness that made Charles think of stitches. He escorted them to the clinic himself for the test, an act small in procedure, but enormous in symbolic change. He watched the children sit on a bench, fingers curled around one another, and he felt the weight of it, that these were lives he was being asked to acknowledge, not by charity, but by blood, and by the way his son had named them. The result, when it came, confirmed paternity for some, suggested strong probability for others pending further tests. The lawyers whispered about percentages and clauses. The news outlets, starved for crisp headlines, tried to render the complexities into simple columns, but the public, touched by the photograph and the story's human side, began to shift. Enough people saw what the children needed: safety, beds, maims, rather than the exactness of a DNA score. Donors wrote checks to a newly styled Whitmore Foundation initiative that promised to support children like Noah's, those who had been raised at the edge. But while lawyers argued, the more dangerous threats continued. Someone sent letters to the house, typed and anonymous, with phrases centered in the middle of the page: leave or else. The police treated them empirically and recorded them. Olivia tightened the watch schedule. More cameras were installed. The household practiced drills like a small army. The children learned where to hide in the pantry and where to wait for an adult's voice. Fear became a practical skill, and then an unnecessary tutor when a neighbor caught a shadow in the late hours and called the police, who found tire tracks in the gravel and someone's flannel print on a fence post. Preston's network was fingered through small connections: a menial contractor who traded favors, a driver who had been paid for odd jobs and who had been seen near the lane on the night of the Oaks burning. But nothing pinned him directly to the act. The police investigation, like so many public processes, moved with the glacial pace of procedure and the human limitation of circumstantial evidence. It was in the end an ambiguous tangle, sufficient to suggest motive, insufficient to convict. The Whitmore house, meanwhile, undertook the daily work of family.
The room that had been Elena's study became, slowly, a shared space, where a workbook and a child's drawing might cohabit with a ledger. Children's shoes lined the hallway along with polished dress shoes. Someone had hammered a low shelf for them to rest their feet. The chapel, once a sterile archive of memorials, began to host new rituals. Charles authorized a small program to repaint its benches and to install a dedicated corner for community gatherings, a room where people could come, not just to speak of loss, but to be held. He signed paperwork to open the chapel for local groups and small concerts, and for a weekly breakfast program. It was a quiet kind of institutional reparation, resources redirected, doors propped open. The reopening of the chapel was small and public. The mayor sent a note that was more about formality than feeling. A local photographer captured images that were not slick with scandal, but warm with human texture. Charles made a short speech that was not an oration bridging a world, but a modest description of work to be undertaken, a fund set aside for mentorship and schooling in Noah's name, a promise to staff a helpline, to partner with Renee and others to investigate past abuses in clinics that had, through neglect or error, damaged families. He stood at the podium not as a man announcing salvation, but as one declaring a program of labor. He also spoke in the language that had commanded his life before, but now tasted different on his tongue: naming. He called out, in front of the congregation and the small press contingent, the names of the children: Malik, Zoe, Ella, Jaden, and said, in a voice that did not carry a generative flourish, but an ordinary truth, "These are Noah's. They are ours to hold." The line was simple and fierce. The photographers took the picture again, the image that would be used both by tabloids and by real humans. It was the kind of vulnerability that leaves you open to attack. It was also the kind of honesty that changes the scalpels of rumor into a tool for repair. Preston responded by filing a more formal legal challenge, not against the children, but against the board's process. He sought a conservatorship review and demanded records. The suit promised a long, expensive trajectory. The foundation's counsel, older men in plain suits, warned of the possibility of a protracted fight that would drain resources. Charles signed documents that put him on record as willing to defend the children with the institution's funds and with his own. He made appearances in courtrooms that smelled of old coffee and the linoleum of bureaucratic spaces, and where the language of guardianship and fiduciary duty was precise enough to slice. The climax, when it came, happened in a room called the hearing chamber, where wood panels and fluorescent lights conspired to make every sentence sound more official than it felt.
The judge listened to both sides, the board's counsel methodically chairing the fiduciary concerns, Preston's attorney mapping out a narrative of possible mismanagement. Charles' counsel, quieter and less theatrical, responding with a focus on safeguarding children and on the moral obligation to a son's last request. Renee offered testimony about the Memphis files, careful, factual, limited to what she could authenticate. She explained the difficulties of establishing a perfect chain of custody for records that had been misfiled years prior, but made clear the plausibility of errors that could have created someone else's miscatalogued identity. She was not melodramatic, she was precise. Devante, who had been reluctant to be called to a podium, spoke quietly of the children's home life, what he had seen, what neighbors had recalled. Maya spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had been present for the long and difficult work of care. Noah's letter was entered as an exhibit, the son's words on fragile paper, placed within the space of law. Preston, who had built a career on careful ambiguity, found his case hinge on practicalities rather than moral argument. Did the foundation perform due diligence? Were records properly maintained? Could the trustees produce a plan for potential liability? Charles' counsel answered with a novel argument for the courtroom. Institutions had obligations that reached beyond measured risk. They had to account for the dignity of children whose names had been called in the plain script of a son's request. The judge recognized the difficulty of the issue with a judicial sigh that admitted there were no clean legal templates for some forms of moral reckoning. The rooms where power played out were not where the real work was done. The board could argue about liabilities in polished spaces. The house did the slow, patient labor of living. At night, Charles sat with the children while Maya made tea and Devante paced a yard. He learned to do small things as acts of presence, to boil water just to make a pancake run a little thinner in the middle, to read a chapter of a book he did not understand, to watch a child sleep the way one watches a fragile treasure. Small acts accumulated meaning in a way that grand pronouncements rarely do. An unexpected consequence of opening the house came in the form of neighbors offering help. A local tutor volunteered to give writing lessons. A retired seamstress taught Malik how to repair a hymn. The business of generosity changed the tone of the estate in small, real ways. People who had once seen the Whitmore property as untouchable lawns now found routes to connection: a soup pot left by a neighbor,
a familiar face at the grocery. The system of law kept moving in its own tempo, but the household began to establish rights of its own. The foundation launched a new pilot program, Noah's Table, aimed at breakfast clubs for children from a range of under-resourced neighborhoods.
The initiative was not announced as a PR stunt, but as a practical step. Funds committed to local community centers for meals and mentorship. Reporters covered the new program with a mix of skepticism and reluctant acknowledgement. Donors lined up, cheered more by the human images than the legal fine print. Renee persisted in her investigation of the Memphis Ledger. She found an old clerk who remembered a name misfiled and a brown folder that had been sent to an archive with the wrong label. The forensic record was not perfect. There were holes. But what emerged was a pattern of administrative failure that suggested the possibility of Isaiah, another child whose existence had been folded into clerical error. The name was not proof alone. Proof would require more tests, more permissions, more legal scaffolding. But the possibility gave a new moral edge to their cause. If a system had allowed a child to be misrecorded, it meant more than one family might have been harmed. Charles recognized that the Whitmore house, with resources and reach, had a role to play in attempting to right not just its own wrongs, but the institutional ones it now occupied. A final public reckoning for the immediate arc of things came not as a courtroom drama, but as a boardroom standoff. Preston called a special meeting to force a vote on the foundation's leadership. He argued, in clipped phrases, that stability required the old mode of discretion, and that donors would flee if the foundation suggested its policies might be guided by private family letters. He painted a picture of peril. The trustees listened. Charles, who had watched himself evolve in small increments, entered the room with the same understated armor he'd learned. No sharp gestures, no performative displays. He folded Noah's letter and set it on the polished table. He spoke not as an accuser, but as someone offering a bargain that contained both sacrifice and principle. If the board chooses reputation over children, he said, I will not lend the Whitmore name to that choice. I will close the foundation. I will redirect its assets to a new nonprofit that will be accountable in a different way, because I will not be part of any institutional act that makes children invisible. The words landed with a solidity that surprised even him. Trustees looked at one another and considered the optics and the moral balance. Preston smiled, thinned. He made one last effort to sway opinion with a lawyer's promise of minimal disruption, but the mood had shifted. The delicate thing they were balancing, risk and responsibility, tilted toward the responsibility. The vote was narrow. A few trustees abstained. Some grit their teeth. One left the room shaking an envelope as if to keep its contents from striking him. Preston, outmaneuvered in the cleanest way, made his exit shortly after. News of the vote leaked. Another press cycle began.
But this time the narrative included the word restructure and the phrase children's agency and a story of institutional self-correction. It was not the happy ending of a parade, but it was a step. The meeting with Renee that solidified some of the deeper truths occurred in a small conference room that smelled faintly of institutional coffee and archival dust. She unfurled photocopies, patient, factual, careful, and pointed to discrepancies in dates and signatures. It's a long shot, she admitted, but the pattern is there. She explained how, decades ago, a small policy error could have led to a child's documents being misplaced, and how, over time, misplacement became erasure. Charles listened to her with an intensity that was new to him, an embrace of the inconvenient, the messy reality of human systems. He asked questions about how to help, not with grand checks, but with practical fixes. He pledged the foundation would fund an audit of regional records, an effort toward institutional clarity that might help others. When further confirmation came, partial, careful, phrased in the cautious language of scientific certitude, it was not cinematic. A new name surfaced in an institutional ledger and lined up with a cluster of artifacts that together suggested a misassigned child at a clinic 50 years before. DNA, where applicable, suggested possible links, but the files needed more work. The discovery of Isaiah, in the way it unfolded, was less a sudden miracle and more a slow accumulation of evidence, a number here, a name there, a witness recollection, a clerical note in the corner of a ledger.
It was enough, in public terms, to demand that the foundation renounce the practice of secrecy and to offer a plan for reconciliation where possible. They planted a new plaque at the oak. It was a small, deliberate act, 2 brass plates now set together, Noah's name, and beside it, Isaiah's. The oak scar remained, a blackened ribbon of bark that would forever carry a memory of harm, but the new brass shone and reflected a sky that was hesitant and bright. Children helped with the placement, their hands small on the cool metal. Maya held them steady while Charles fastened the screws with a concentrated hand. The act was not a triumph, so much as a public acknowledgement that naming matters. The chapel reopened with a modest service that included a few speeches and a long silence in which guests were asked to consider the cost of invisibility. The mayor read a brief statement about community and responsibility. A pastor offered a prayer of sorts that was less about theology than about the human task of repair. Charles did not speak much in public then. Private acts mattered more to him. But he stood at the back of the chapel at the end, watching the children move around the aisles in an ungainly, earnest way, and felt a steadiness in his chest that was like a stitch sewn to a frayed seam.
As months passed, domestic rhythms formed around small practices. Mornings began with oatmeal and a playlist of Noah's favorite songs discovered on an old MP3 player in the attic. An extra toothbrush found a slot in the bathroom. Malik learned to tie a tie for formal events and practiced in the mirror until the knot looked dignified. Zoe took ownership of the piano in the sitting room and braved a simple scale, though her fingers sometimes missed notes. Charles learned where Jaden liked his socks folded and what made Ella's laugh jump across a room. They fought, 2 older children on a rainy afternoon over a toy, but it was the ordinary friction of family life, not the defensive cruelty of one-party power. Maya taught them how to make bread in the kitchen and nudged Charles, over time, into small adventures, a grocery run in an unglamorous car, an hour spent assembling shelves in a playroom with a hand drill and Twitter's critics nowhere in sight. Devante, whose presence had at first been an uneasy insertion, became an essential shape in the house. He helped with carpentry, with tutoring, with the odd legal question that landed like a thorn. He and Charles argued once about how to enroll Malik in a school that prioritized the arts over strict discipline. Their conversation, initially loud and awkward, closed with a mutual, uncomfortable laughter and a knowledge that compromise meant losing the pretense of control. The house, once a place of carefully controlled surfaces, became messy enough to feel lived in. The foundation announced its first scholarship in Noah's name, a small grant to support children from neighborhoods where paperwork or clerical error might otherwise make them invisible. The application process was intentionally accessible. The trustees, who had once feared rebranding, found themselves reading essays about resilience and about the small work of care that made childhood possible. A small ceremony marked the awarding of the scholarship. The recipients were introduced, and they spoke with the sort of honesty only young people can produce when asked about what a chance could mean. For Charles, it was an awkward public moment. Speaking in front of other people was never comfortable, but his words were short and sincere. We will do what we can to make sure a child's name is not lost again. There were setbacks. Preston's legal devices did not simply evaporate. A former trustee publicly criticized Charles in op-eds that suggested the Whitmore name had been misused. Anonymous threats continued in threads and in late-night messages. The arson investigation remained unresolved. But in private, the Whitmore household learned how to absorb the hits and reconfigure. They repaired the oak with a professional arborist who explained how trees can grow around damage, how a scar becomes a part of identity rather than an erasure.
A small plaque honoring community volunteers was installed beside the children's names, a gesture that spoke of the many hands it had taken to hold the work. The attic remained a place of small excavations. There were more letters, Elena's voice threaded through them, soft admonitions that urged kindness and ordinary fidelity. In one note, she wrote of dinners where people were asked to sit together across class lines and to speak of their days. She believed in conversation as a civic act. Charles kept these letters in a small cedar box still, reading them before bed sometimes, as if to remember the rhythm of a better life. The children settled more into the house's geography. Zoe claimed a corner in the library and insisted on the ritual of dusting the lower shelves. She took to straightening a small row of children's books. Malik started a small club with a neighbor who had teenage children and taught them skateboard tricks in the drive. Ella would draw pictures and tape them, uninvited, to frames in the hallway. Jaden learned to whistle,
a thin sound that echoed up the stairwell like a small bird. The house's soundscape changed from a museum's hush to a family's chorus. Laughter, the clink of dishes, the hum of an old radio somewhere. They took a family photograph in the hallway, framed it, and hung it among the estate's portraits. It was not the slick portrait one sees in campaign ads. Noah's photograph, with its candid grin, remained there as a presence. The new photograph placed beside it showed a man older and less complete in his face, a woman with small smiles, 4 children at varying angles of sincerity, a brother whose stands at the edge said watchful loyalty, a housekeeper who looked into the camera with a steady gaze that asked for nothing and accepted what was offered. The hallway's light caught the picture in a way that made the faces readable not as icons, but as real people who carry faults and kindness in equal measure. The public continued to watch. Some articles praised the Whitmore Foundation's new direction. Others wondered if the publicity would last. Preston continued his legal choreography from the sidelines, his threats becoming less about winning and more about being heard. There were interviews that Charles did not want to give, and those he did, awkwardly, for the sake of the program. He learned slowly to say what mattered without seeking applause. He became less interested in absolution and more invested in accountability. The final note of repair the house undertook was practical and felt more like work than symbolism. They launched Noah's Table in a modest community center down the block, not at the Whitmore estate. Volunteers from the neighborhood cooked and served, some of them men and women who had known rank and had learned modesty. The program welcomed kids who had been affected by a variety of bureaucratic lapses and errors, children who had fallen through cracks that needed repair.
It was not a grand parade. It was a modest set of benches, a long table, and enough food that the worry of getting a meal at the end of the day was relieved for a while. Renee continued to work with the regional archives and called occasionally to update Charles on small triumphs, a corrected ledger here, a document found there, a family traced back to its roots who had been helped. The work of reconciliation, she insisted, was less a single act and more a slow, patient labor of sorting and naming and allowing the wrongs to be noticed. Name them, she said often in their meetings, echoing Noah without claiming it as her own. Once named, you can't pretend they were never there. The oak healed slowly, its new plaque weathered seasons and weather, the brass turning a softened gold. The scar remained, and children liked to run their fingers along the blackened ridgeline and imagine that the tree had been through something and survived. Charles often walked to the tree at dusk and lingered there, sometimes alone, sometimes with Maya or Devante. He put his hand on the bark and felt the roughness under his palm. It grounded him, as if the physical presence anchored a moral lesson. On a late spring morning, when small blooms lifted their faces towards cautious sun, the house felt for the first time like a place that had been lived into rather than arranged. The children crowded the kitchen table with sticky fingers and warm faces. A photograph, a new one, sat in the hall's frame, all of them arranged awkwardly, blue shirts present in a quiet echo of Noah's own colors, but not as an imitation. The photograph recorded a family that had learned to keep time together by shared small acts. Charles hung the photograph on the hallway wall with his own hands. It was a private finality of sorts, an image that signaled not a completion, but an ongoing commitment. He stepped back and adjusted the frame level, the way housekeepers often do, and saw, beyond the glass, the shapes of his people moving through the house. Maya, no longer merely a caretaker in his mind, but a person whose labor had a dignity the estate's ledgers had never appreciated, smiled at a child and folded a piece of laundry with a practiced tenderness. Devante argued with Malik over shoelaces in a tone that was both impatient and fond. Olivia brought in mail with a steady, watchful gait. Dr. Penrose stopped by with a thermos and a practical medical tip for Jaden's scraped knee. Charles felt the weight of the house settle into a different kind of balance, less monolithic, more human. He had been a man who once thought legacy was measured by plaques and endowments. The house, the children, and the letters had demanded a new definition. Legacy, he was learning, could be the care of small things, the steadying presence at a child's bedside, the clarity to say someone's name aloud, the will to use institutional power to correct a wrong rather than to obscure it.
As the sun moved across the floor and dust motes drifted like small exhalations of time, Charles placed his hand on the cedar box where Elena's letters slept. He had kept them close as a way of keeping the direction set by someone who had believed in belonging. He had also learned to act without ceremony and to accept that some acts do not yield immediate satisfaction. They are long games. They are the work of decades. At day's end, the house made the small noises of ordinary repair. Dishes clinked,
A child's shoe thudded against the stair. A kettle hummed. The oak was visible from the kitchen window, its new plaques catching the dying light. Children's laughter threaded through the rooms in the way a good textile frays into the seam of something larger. Charles paused before the hallway photograph, and in a voice that had learned humility through the ache of absence, he said simply, "We will keep their names." He did not promise miracles. He did not promise a pristine resolution to all legal entanglements. He promised instead labor and presence, small acts of responsibility that could be counted, in breakfasts made, letters kept, plaques fastened, scholarships awarded. He had learned that the currency of legacy was not only money, but moral attention, being present when it mattered, and standing before scrutiny willing to be judged by the work rather than the pronouncement. The house breathed with the ease of a place that had begun to be lived in properly. In the hallway, where the new framed photograph glowed in the late light, a child's small hand reached out and brushed the glass as if making contact with history. Charles watched, and the sound of the gesture was like a small, hopeful vow. If you followed their journey and want to hear more about their work and what happens next, please subscribe and share this story with someone who believes in the power of belonging.